If you close your eyes and picture a medieval town square, you might expect to see armored knights, bishops in tall hats, and peasants bowing under sacks of grain. But stay there a moment longer, and you'll notice something quieter and more familiar. A food stall tucked near the church steps, a small fire burning, and the smell of something roasting. While history tends to emphasize plagues, wars, and sermons, life was also lived in the simplest of ways, with people gathering around food, including what we might cheekily call junk food. Not junk because it came in shiny wrappers or was deep-fried in vats of oil, but because it was quick, greasy, salty, and frowned upon by those who thought life should be more pious and disciplined. In fact, if you really want a bedtime story, the comforting truth is that medieval people were not so different from us. After long hours of toil, they wanted a bite of something cheap, hot, and tasty, even if it wasn't strictly good for them. Vendors popped up at fairs, on bridges, or at the edge of markets, hawking small bites. Meat pies stuffed with questionable fillings, roasted chestnuts, fritters dusted with sugar when available, and skewers of meat spiced with whatever herbs they could afford. These were eaten on the go, without knives or forks, grabbed with bare hands, shared among friends, or snatched up before a sermon. A medieval chronicler would never waste ink on such humble details, but to the common man or woman, these small indulgences brought more joy than any royal feast. They were messy, greasy, and a little bit dangerous, exactly what makes junk food so irresistible across all centuries. One of the stars of medieval snacking culture was the humble pie. Not the neat slices of fruit pie you know today, but hand-sized pastries filled with bits of pork, fish, or beef, sometimes fresh, sometimes not so fresh. Bakers would encase meat in a thick crust of dough, partly to keep it sealed and partly to disguise the flavor if it had turned a little dubious. Customers would pay a penny or two, bite into the steaming parcel, and hope the meat wasn't too chewy. In big towns like London, pie sellers had a reputation similar to that of modern fast food chains. Beloved by customers, scorned by moralists. Preachers warned that spending coins on pies was wasteful. Magistrates worried that vendors spread disease. Yet the stalls thrived because people loved them. Imagine workers from the docks warming their hands on hot pies during a cold morning, or children sneaking them while their parents shopped for candles and wool. Sweet pies also existed, filled with apples, raisins, or nuts and flavored with honey or a sprinkle of imported sugar when someone could afford it. These were luxuries, but, once tasted, unforgettable. The pie was medieval Europe's answer to the burger. Portable, filling, cheap, and endlessly versatile. And just like today's burger joints, the quality ranged from heavenly to horrifying, depending on where you bought it. Yet the craving for something wrapped, warm, and easy never went away. People risked sour stomachs for that fleeting joy of biting into pastry, proof that comfort food is timeless. Another treat that made its way into the hands of townsfolk was the fritter. Picture small pieces of fruit or dough, battered and fried until golden, then sprinkled with sugar or drizzled with honey. In an age when ovens were expensive and communal, frying offered a quick way to create snacks. Street sellers would dangle fritters on sticks, tempting children and adults alike with their sweet scent. Apples, figs, and even little bits of cheese could be dropped into batter, sizzling in oil, and served fresh. For a society where sweetness was rare, sugar being an exotic, imported luxury from the East, even a small bite of something glazed felt decadent. These fritters were often linked with fairs and festivals, times when ordinary rules were loosened. Music played, jugglers performed, and vendors fried up sizzling treats for the crowd. Of course, like all junk food, they weren't the healthiest choice. Oils were reused until rancid, and the sweetness masked the lack of freshness. But when eaten in the glow of lanterns, surrounded by laughter, they tasted magical. Imagine sitting on a wooden bench in a noisy fairground, holding a hot fritter that burns your fingers, while minstrels strum their lutes and children chase each other in the dust. For a fleeting moment, the world felt lighter, sweeter, and far removed from the drudgery of work and fasting days. That perhaps was the greatest power of medieval junk food, not nutrition but escape. Savory snacks also held their ground. Roasted nuts, almonds, chestnuts, and hazelnuts were sold in cones of paper or cloth, often seasoned with salt or spices when available. They crackled in the pan, and vendors shouted rhymes to attract customers, much like modern street hawkers. Chestnuts, in particular, were beloved during cold seasons, warming hands as much as stomachs. Meat skewers were another common find. Small chunks of pork or chicken threaded onto sticks and grilled over open flames, flavored with onions or herbs, made quick bites for people too poor to afford a whole roast. These skewers filled the air with rich smoke, luring even those who pretended to be virtuous. Fish, too, appeared in the street food trade, especially in towns near rivers. Fried eels, salted herring, and dried fish cakes made up the medieval equivalent of fish and chips. To the church's dismay, people sometimes bought these treats even on fasting days, when eating meat was forbidden. But hunger often trumped discipline. Imagine walking through a medieval bridge lined with stalls, the air thick with the scent of grilling meat, roasted nuts, and fried fish, mingling with the less pleasant odors of horses and unwashed streets. You'd clutch your cloak tighter, pay a penny to a vendor, and feel that warm comfort of street food sliding into your stomach. Junk food, in its essence, was survival disguised as pleasure. It was the taste of rebellion against hunger and rules alike. Sweet cravings were not ignored. Candied nuts, strips of preserved fruit, and even simple honey cakes were popular among children and adults. Sugar, as mentioned, was rare, so honey was the go-to sweetener. Bakers would mix flour, eggs, and honey into dense little cakes, sold at fairs or markets. Gingerbread also made its appearance in the Middle Ages, though it was quite different from the crisp cookies we know today. Medieval gingerbread was chewy, spiced with ginger, cloves, and sometimes pepper, bound together with honey, and often pressed into molds to make patterns. These little sweets were highly prized at festivals and pilgrimages. Pilgrim routes were dotted with sellers of gingerbread, each claiming their recipe was blessed or special. For weary travelers, a piece of spiced sweetness was a reward after miles of mud and prayer. Children, meanwhile, looked forward to fairs where gingerbread figures were sold in the shape of saints or animals. Eating one was both fun and sacred. In truth, these sugary morsels were the closest thing to candy that ordinary folk could afford. They were sticky, fragrant, and left you wanting more. Eating them at night, under flickering torches, while music and laughter filled the air, turned them into memories that lived longer than the taste. And for the adults, the sugar rush was just as addictive as today. Even in the most pious age, no one could resist a sweet bite after a long day. Of course, not all junk food was harmless. Food safety, in medieval terms, was a gamble. Meat pies could harbor spoiled fillings, fish cakes might be made from leftovers well past their prime, and oils used for frying fritters were often rancid. Yet people accepted these risks, because hunger was worse. Critics, often clerics and city officials, condemned street food not just for its dangers, but for its temptations. Eating between meals was frowned upon by the church, and indulging in sweets was sometimes considered gluttony. Preachers warned against wasting money on pies instead of saving for alms. But just as today, the warnings fell on half-listening ears. People craved quick comfort, and food stalls provided it. For women who could not afford ovens, for men without time to cook after work, for travelers in strange towns, these foods were lifelines. They may have been greasy, but they were warm, filling, and cheap. And like modern junk food, the forbidden nature made them even more desirable. You can almost hear a medieval teenager sneaking fritters behind the churchyard wall, laughing with friends, and feeling that they'd gotten away. The culture of medieval junk food also reflected social differences. Wealthier folk had feasts with roasted peacocks and exotic spices, but even they sometimes slipped into the streets for a quick bite. Chronicles tell of nobles disguising themselves at fairs, mingling with commoners, and grabbing roasted nuts or fritters out of curiosity. For the poor, however, these foods were not occasional treats but daily necessities. They could not afford kitchens, ovens, or time to cook. Street food was survival. Markets buzzed with their hunger, and vendors thrived because of it. In port towns, sailors unloaded goods by day and bought hot pies by night. In villages, seasonal fairs brought rare sweets, creating memories for children that lasted a lifetime. Junk food was not merely about flavor, it was about community. Eating in the open, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, connected people in ways that banquets never could. The shared act of biting into a greasy pie or splitting a cone of roasted chestnuts was a bond stronger than sermons. This sense of togetherness is perhaps the sweetest flavor of all. So when you drift to sleep tonight, think not only of kings and castles, but of the countless ordinary souls who ended their days with snacks. Think of the fishmonger sneaking fried eels after work, the child savoring a gingerbread figure at a fair, the tired laborer clutching a steaming pie in frozen hands. These were the real moments of medieval life, small, greasy joys that never made it into history books. Junk food, after all, is not about nutrition or elegance. It is about comfort, rebellion, and indulgence. The medieval version may have lacked golden arches and soda fountains, but it carried the same spirit. People have always longed for food that was quick, tasty, and just a little bit sinful. And perhaps that is why these stories feel oddly soothing at bedtime. They remind us that across centuries, humans have sought the same small happiness. Something warm in the belly, sweet on the tongue, and comforting to the soul. Now, as you lay your head on the pillow, let those greasy pies and honey cakes drift through your dreams, knowing that history, though often grim, was also flavored with laughter, sugar, and the irresistible smell of fried dough. Sleep well, for even in the Middle Ages, people knew how to snack their way to happiness.